The Kuta Sikh is Chelek Chavches, the Sikh for Matos Aleph, Lilu Nishmas of Yosef Ben Yamin Ben Menashe Kaltman. In the beginning of Parashas Matos, the Torah teaches us the dinim of Nedarim. Today's discussion is going to be about the neder or of a katan. If a katan makes a promise or a vow, and a katan in this case, we're going to mostly speak about the year before Bar Bas Mitzvah, a girl from the age of 11, a boy from the age of 12, where the Torah teaches us that their neder, if they know what they're doing, if they know to whom they are making the neder, their neder is valid. And we're going to discuss this in the context of the Rambam. Very, very fascinatingly, there seem to be two different versions of the Rambam, and the Rebbe is going to bring all of these pieces together and to explain to us both versions in the Rambam and both versions in the Gemara in the most beautiful possible way. In the beginning, it seems a little bit complicated, but as you get to the end, you see how everything fits in perfectly into its right spot. It is absolutely, I'm excited to learn this together with you. So let us begin. In Hilchas Nedarim brings the Rambam from Mishnah, dem din beneged nidrei katan. So Hilchas Nedarim, the Rambam brings the following din. This is based on a Mishnah in Masechta Nida, Daf Mem Hey Amud Beis. A boy from the age of 12, a girl from the age of 11, shenishbu, another that made a shvua or a neder, various different vows that had they been an adult, they would be obligated to fulfill their vows. In this case, they're not yet fully adults. So the din is Beitkin Eisan, V'Sheil Eisan, Im Yodim L'Shem Mi Nadru. We test them, we ask them, do you know in whose name you are making this neder? The pasuk says, Ishki Yafli Neder La Hashem. When a person makes a neder, it is in the name of Hashem, and therefore we have to know that they understand what they're saying, that they're making a neder in the name of Hashem. If they do nedrei and kayamin, if they know what they're doing, then their neder is valid. Im layadu, and if they did not understand, if they don't know the weight of their neder, ein b'nedreim ub'nedreim klum, their words, their neder has no validity. And they have to be tested throughout that entire year. Which is the 12th year for the girl, the 13th year for the boy. For the girl, from when she turns 11 and a day until she turns 12. And for a boy, from when he turns 12 in a day until he turns 13, that entire year, their neder has potential, and therefore they have to be tested throughout the year. Every time they make a neder, do they understand to whom they are making this neder? And then the Rambam continues in the next halacha. Ketzad, what does it mean they have to be tested a whole year? In the beginning of the year, they made a neder. So we tested them. Do they understand what they're saying? And they knew, they understood. And so we validated their neder. And then they made a second neder, maybe even at the end of the year. So it's been 10 months since the last neder, and they had passed the test in the last one. Nevertheless, they have to be tested again. We don't say, you don't say, we already tested them 10 months ago, and they knew then. Why should we test them again? Throughout this entire year before Bar or Bas Mitzvah, every time they make a neder, they have to be tested again to assure us that they know that they know what they are, to whom they are making this neder. This is what the Rambam says. In other words, let's just make sure we understand. The Rambam says that year they have to make the entire year they have to be tested, even if in the beginning of the year they already proved to us that they know what they're doing. Nevertheless, throughout that entire year, they must be tested again and again every time they make a neder. The Kesef Mishnah, the Rambam has the following question: I don't know where this comes from. What is the source of this Rambam? And the Kesef Mishnah explains this question. The Gemara in Masechta Nida says, why do you have to tell me that you should check a whole year? Seemingly it's obvious. Every time they make a neder, we have to make sure that they know. Says the Gemara, I would think, that if it was a case where in the beginning of the year, about 30 days in, we tested them, this case is speaking in the feminine, we tested her and she didn't know. I would think once they don't know, they're disqualified for the year and there's no reason to check anymore. Kamasmala know that even though they didn't know in the beginning of the year, maybe later in the year they'll learn and then their neder will be valid. So you already see that the Rambam and the Gemara are different. The Rambam is saying, even though in the beginning of the year they did know, you still have to check them, test them throughout the year. The Gemara is saying that even though in the beginning of the year they didn't know, you still have to test them throughout the year. So it's understood from the Gemara that why are we testing later in the year? Because in the beginning of the year they didn't know. So later in the year, maybe they do know. So that's why we have to test them again. But it's understood from the Gemara that if in the beginning of the year they already proved that they know how to make a neder, the word lahafleis is from the word ishkiyafli neder, that literally means to express, to say words. In this context, it's going to come up again and again. Lahafleis means if they know how to make a neder. In other words, the shemi nadru, they understand the weight of what they're saying, etc., etc. But the understanding from the Gemara is that if in the beginning of the year they did know, they proved that they know how to make a neder, then there's no need to check anymore. They already proved. They graduated into making nedarim. So the Kesef Mishnah is saying the mashmos, the understanding of the Gemara is different. So where does the Rambam get this halacha from? That if in the beginning of the year they did know how to make a neder, you still have to check them throughout the year. Uner is Messiah, and therefore the Kesef Mishnah concludes the Efsher Rabbeinu Ayageris Eichat Badakna Lamed V'Yada Lahafleis Eimatuli Livde Kamash Balon. Says the Kesef Mishnah, the Rambam must have had a different girsa in the Gemara. The girsa and the Gemara of the Rambam must have been that when they checked and she did know how to make a neder, I would think that once she already proved that she knows, we don't need to check anymore. Kamash Malon, that you still have to check throughout the year. So that in other words, the reason, according to the Kesef Mishnah, that the Rambam says the halacha, that even though in the beginning of the year she did know how to make a neder, you still have to continue during the year to test her or them, is because that was his girsa in Gemara. Unlike our girsa in the Gemara that has the opposite implication. The Rebbe continues, the Radvaz also says, like the Kesef Mishnah, that clearly the Rabbi had a different girsa than our Gemara, and the girsa is that the Gemara is saying, I would think that because she, in the beginning of the year, she knew how to make a neder, therefore I don't have to check again during the year. Kamash Malon, that you still have to check. When his Meisven and the Radvaz continues, this is a better girsa. This is a more correct girsa. Because if you're going to follow the girsa of our svarim, the way the widespread version of the Gemara, you're going to ask a question. According to our girsa, we're saying that I would think that because she didn't know in the beginning of the year, therefore I shouldn't check the rest of the year. Kamash Malon, that you check the rest of the year. Why would I think that? Why would I think that if someone doesn't know something at the age of 11, they may still not know it at the age of 11 and a half? So what's the chiddush? Obviously, if a person doesn't know, you wait a couple of months and you check again. So the fact that the Gemara is saying that I would have thought that if she didn't know in the beginning of the year, you shouldn't test for the rest of the year, and therefore the Mishnah has told me that you do have to test, it's not a chiddush. Why would I even think that? So to say the Rambam's version, that I would have thought that once you already know, you don't have to check. And the chiddush of the Mishnah is that you do have to check, even though they already proved that they know, that's a much better chiddush. As afal pi, well, if he gives us a beinu kamash malan tuva, but according to the Rambam, it's a big chiddush. As afal pi was nitzu yedin mitchilas hashana, that even though in the beginning of the year they did know how to make a neder, steltman nit after chazaka, as there is yedei lahaflis, we don't create a chazaka and say, okay, once he proved that he knows, he already knows. But throughout the year, even at the end of the year, it's almost bar mitzvah, we still have to test him again. So the focus here is on what would I think? What's the salkatay techamina? And as we go through the sikha, this is going to be a very important nakuda. What is the salkatay techamina? What is the svara that I would have had? And because of that, the Mishnah has to clarify that. So according to our Gemara, I would have thought that if in the beginning of the year she didn't know, I wouldn't check for the rest of the year. Because sort of to say that once she didn't know in the beginning of the year, she disqualified herself. I keep going she and he because in the sikha it's going back and forth. But obviously the same halacha applies, male or female. It's just that the female starts a year earlier because bar mitzvah is a year earlier. But so our Gemara, it tells us that I would have thought that in the beginning of the year she did not know. You shouldn't check again because basically she disqualified herself for the year. Kamash Malan, they have to check during the year, which the Radvaz says is difficult to say that that I would think that. And the Rambam is saying, according to the Kesef Mishnah and the Radvaz, that is the Girsa in the Gemara. According to the Rambam, or the Rambam is following that Girsa in the Gemara, that if in the beginning of the year she did know how to check, she did know how to make a neder, I would think that that's good enough. Kamash Malon, that you have to check every time she makes a neder. She doesn't have the chazaka that because she knew in the beginning of the year means the rest of the year she's going to know. So seemingly the Kesef and the Mishnah and the Radvaz have a very good solution. The Rambam had a different girsa in the Gemara, and therefore the Rambam in Hilchas Nedarim paskins according to that girsa in Gemara. However, that's going to pose a problem for us. Aber in Pirush Mishnayis, schreibt the Rambam beperush. But however, in Pirush Mishnayis, the Rambam writes differently. The Rambam writes, like our Gemara, Nivdakim Kol Yud Beis, they have to be tested the entire 12 months. We would think that if you tested them at the beginning of the year and they did not know, so that ends the investigation, and you don't test for the rest of the year. Omar Eino Inyan Kain, says the Mishnah, no. That lacha is not like that, but even if in the beginning of the year they didn't know, you could test them later on in the year. Das heißt, dass beim Rambam ist gewähnt die Girse in Gemara wenn Leo de Lafleis. Which if the Pirush Mishnayis the Rambam is teaching in this way means he's following the Gemara like our Girse in Gemara that at the beginning of the year she did not know. And the Chiddush is that despite the fact that she didn't know in the beginning of the year, nevertheless, we check for the rest of the year, maybe later in the year she does know. So you can't tell me like the Kesef Mishnah and the Radvaz, that the Rambam had a different girsa, if clearly in Pirush Mishnayis the Rambam shows that he has the same girsa as us. And this takes us back to our question, if that's the girsa of the Gemara, that implies that if in the beginning of the year she did know how to make a neder, then you don't have to check anymore. So in that case, why does the Rambam paskin that if she didn't know in the beginning of the year, you still have to be by the Kol Hashana? Sorry, why did the Rambam paskin that if she did know in the beginning of the year, that you still have to be by the Kol Hashana? Sif Beis. In Meiri state, the Meiri says like this: you have to test them the entire year. Even if we checked in the beginning of the year and they did not know how to make a neder, we don't say, okay, they already proved that they don't know. But possible that in the course of time that passed, they did learn how to make a neder, and therefore they know, so we test them again. Says the meeting. And the same thing, we're going the other way. Even if in the beginning of the year, they knew how to make a neder, and therefore we validated their neder, and then they made another neder. We do not validate that neder based on the original knowledge. They have to be tested again. So the Meiri is teaching in the Gemara both directions. That if she did know in the beginning of the year, you don't say, oh, she knows already, and then she's good to go, but you have to check again. And if she didn't know in the beginning of the year, you don't say, she doesn't know, you check again, maybe not by now she knows. And based on this we can say, as the Rambam learned, the Rambam also learns like the Meiri. The Girsa in the Gemara, and the Gemara is the Kilafanenu. Even though the Girsa in the Gemara is that in the beginning of the year she did not know, like it's mashma in the Pirush Mishnayis, is that the din from Chiv but the din goes the other way as well. As a filu nimtzu yedin tchilas hashana v'yadu v'niskayim nidran v'yachakach nadru eimekawanis nelachar b'dika. It's quoting here the Meiri. They're saying maybe the Rambam says the same thing. The Rambam holds that it's true that the Girsa in the Gemara is saying one example, but the other example would be true as well. That even though in the beginning of the year they did know how to make a neder, nevertheless, every time they make a neder, they have to be tested again. So maybe that's how it works. The Girsa in the Gemara is like our Girsa, and nevertheless it's not a stira. The Rambam could say that you have to be boidik the entire year, regardless of whether they did know or they didn't know in the beginning of the year. Und das was the Rambam bringt nor dem Eifen von afilu nimtzu yedin. So in that case, why does the Rambam only bring one case, and a case that's different than the Gemara? Kemen verantworten. Well, in them is varana gereser chiddush in them din as a filu badakne v'layadu davanaban abadiku kanal from the Radvaz, because it's a bigger chiddush. If they didn't know in the beginning of the year, then obviously it makes sense that try again. You failed your test. You failed your test today. Wait 30 days. Wait 60 days. Wait some time and try a test again. But to say that even though they do know in the beginning of the year, they still have to check during the year, it's a bigger chiddush, because maybe once they pass the test, they pass the test. No, they have to check a whole year. So the Rambam in Hilchas Nedarim is giving the bigger chiddush. But it's not a stira to the fact that the Girsa in the Gemara is otherwise, because the Girsa, the Gemara is giving one example, and like the Meiri says, and from this we learn in both ways that whether they didn't know, whether they didn't know in the beginning of the year, they have to be tested the whole year. Oh, but the Tiris is L'cherin Glatik, says the Rebbe, that's not a good answer. The Memorav Shach. Eben dem Din is Taka for an Aggressor Chidus, if I was talking to the Gemara. Just like the Rambam chooses to go with this way because this is the greater Chiddush, why would the Gemara not choose those words to imply the greater Chiddush? Therefore, the Gemara is like nitim Chiddush. The fact that the Gemara doesn't say that even if the beginning of the year they knew you still have to be beidik the whole year is moving kanal for kesef Mishnah as im yad lahaflis betchilas Hashem lo yitzarich tu bedika. The Gemara says that if she didn't know in the beginning of the year, then you have to make a bedika for the rest of the year. Implying that if she did know in the beginning of the year, you wouldn't need a bedika anymore, you wouldn't need to test them anymore. Because he has now a chazaka, he has now a reputation that he knows. Once he knows, he knows. So you can't teach in the Rambam like the Meiri that he's teaching in the Gemara both ways, because when you look in the Gemara, there is a clear understanding from the Gemara only one way. One way is that if she doesn't know how to make a bedika in the beginning, how to make a ned in the beginning of the year, then throughout the year we could test her again. But if she did know how to make a ned in the beginning of the year, there's no need for a bedika anymore the rest of the year. We don't have to test them. They already proved that they know. So we're back to our original question: how do we reconcile the Gemara, which is clearly the nusach, the girsa that the Rambam follows, that implies that if they knew in the beginning of the year, you do not need to test them anymore the rest of the year, and the halacha in Rambam, in Hilchas Nedarim, where the Rambam says that even if they did know in the beginning of the year, you still have to test them throughout the year. How do you reconcile what the Gemara says and what the Rambam says? In Sif Gimel, the Rebbe is going to introduce the fact that in the more recent past, a new version of the Rambam's Pirush HaMishnayos. Now, there was this fact that we say that the Rambam had the original Girsa, or the more widespread Girsa of Gemara, is based on the way the Rambam teaches in Pirush HaMishnayos. In the print of the Hitzoas Kapach, which printed many newly found manuscripts that were found primarily from the people that were coming from Yemen, from Taimon, they found a second edition of the Rambam's Pirush HaMishnayos, and here the Rambam actually learns, has a girsa in the Gemara, not like our girsa, but more consistent with the psak of the Rambam in Hilchas Nedarim, and let's see where we go from there. In the more recent years, they published a later version of the Pirush HaMishnayos the Rambam. Und dorten steht Take v'haya eile b'da'atenu shel das ha'omer kein im nishalu u'mitzanum mevinim nechtal milevadkam. I would think that if they were tested and they knew how to make a neder, we would stop testing them for the rest of the year. And the Kamash Malan that no, even though they knew in the beginning of the year, we still have to test them throughout the year. Just says that the Rambam Mishnachrenes Shalei is Taka Geiris in Gemara V'Yadalaflis Uketirutz HaKesef Mishtavar Advas. According to this version of the Pirush HaMishnayos, the Rambam is Geiris in the Gemara, not like our Girsa, but he's Geiris in the Gemara that in the beginning of the year they did know how to make a neder, and nevertheless we have to test for the rest of the year, which explains why the Rambam paskins that way in Sefer Hayad, because in his Madura Basa, in his later version, that is the girsa that he accepts of the Gemara. So that might answer the question why, where the Kesamishta said, where does the Rambam get this halacha from? The Rambam gets this halacha from the fact that he has a different girsa. And even though in the Madura Kama of the Rambam, of the Pirush HaMishnayos the Rambam, his girsa was like our girsa in the Gemara, nevertheless in the Madura Basa, which only was only published more recently, but now we know that the Rambam had a different girsa in the Gemara. It's bleibt aber nicht move on. So this might explain the conflict between our Gemara and the Rambam, that the Rambam had a different version, but it doesn't fully answer our questions. Why? The fact that in the first version of Pirush Mishnayos, the Rambam did accept the girsa of our Gemara, that the Chiddush is in a case where she did not know how to make a neder. Undi Madura from Pirush Mishnayos is Nisparsim Givarim B'chol Tfutzos Yisov Mashachol Deirus, and it is this edition of the Pirush Mishnayos that became widespread in all Jewish circles throughout the generations since the Rambam's times all the way till the Shana Ma'achareinos is moving as the Shittas Rambam Teichdas Anart. It's understood that the Rambam, according to the Rambam, even this version makes sense. When nimmt on eine von die Kammer Tirutzim in Mefarshim von Kasalkataita Chechat Bedakna Liyad Al-Hafles Ema Tule lived there. If you're going to ask, why would I think if she doesn't know that you wouldn't allow her to be tested again later in the year? And there's other answers in Mefarshim how to explain that, why I would think that, and what the Chiddush is. But the fact is that the Rambam does accept that version. Davon gefinnen hasbare, farvasa the Rambam charategat, unangenommen dafke die girse built in the foots of Yad al-Hafles. So now we have to understand, why does the Rambam change his mind? In other words, these two editions are not like there was a mistake in the print and we finally discovered an original manuscript. The Rambam himself rewrote Pirush HaMishnayos Rambam and changed his understanding of the Gemara. Which means in the first print of the first edition of the Pirush HaMishnayos, the Rambam accepted the girsa that we have in the Gemara, the more widespread girsa, and then the Rambam changed. So we have to understand, why does the Rambam change? In other words, it's true that we see in Hilchas Nedarim that the Rambam likes this version better, which is why he paskins this way. So we don't have a question on the Rambam in Hilchas Nedarim because he's following this girsa in the Gemara. But now that we know that there was an original version in the Rambam, why does the Rambam change his mind? How did he understand it in the first place? And what was the need to change his mind? The Refunder is nachgresser, and the question is even greater. Late girsas Rambam Madura Basra v'yad lahafles v'tushkum achidish niflo. According to the second version of the Rambam, of the Rambam, how he learns in the Gemara, this introduces an incredible chiddush. As afal pivas b'chala teira kula falasman zechav chazaka. Even though throughout the entire Torah there's a concept of chazaka. Chazaka means that when something is proven or something, there is a reason to give this a sense of permanence. For example, a person has been living in a house for 3 years. So even though he doesn't have proof that it was his, but the very fact that he was there for 3 years, that's a chazaka. If a person proves that he knows something, so he knows it, so that should form a chazaka, a sense of permanence of this knowledge. He's by nedarim adish, but we see that by nedarim it's different. Even though we tested him in the beginning of the year, and he proved to us that he knows how to make a neder, therefore he has to be tested again. Maybe he changed. That this is a major chiddush. That we're deviating from the norm, and we're saying chazaka doesn't work. Nachmer, additionally, from the words of the Rambam are that first you test him, and only then do we validate the neder. Is garmashmas bizmi is in bedik atzveiten mol is a neder kalki neder netafilin misafik. The way that Rambam writes it implies that until he is tested, it's not like, okay, let's say that this is possibly a neder, and let's confirm via the test. It's not a neder at all until the test is done. As the lashon is in the Tur, it is not a neder until he's tested again. Although he already has a chazaka that he knows how to make a neder. He was tested in the beginning of the year and he passed the test. So we want to understand, why does the Rambam change from the original version to the new version if by doing so he is now breaking, so to speak, the concept of chazaka. We need a very powerful reason why the Rambam changes, rescinds his first version, built in the futza, and now accepts the less widespread girsa, and this novel concept as that we don't rely on the chazaka at all. So To summarize where we're holding up until here, we now have two girsois in the Rambam. So that of the Rambam in the Gemara. So that explains why, despite the fact that in Pirush Mishnayis La Rambam, the Rambam has the girsa of our Gemara, nevertheless the Rambam paskins in his halachas not like our Gemara, because the Rambam is pasking like a different version in the Gemara. So that explains that stira. And that's what the Kesef Mishnah said. That's what the Radva says. Okay. What remains to understand is if there's two versions in the Rambam, what is the Rambam? How does the Rambam understanding the Madura? How does the Rambam understanding the Gemara in his first version? And once that makes sense, why does the Rambam then change to the Madura Basra, while doing so, bringing on an incredible chiddush that we don't find anywhere else in Torah? So, in other words, we have to understand what is the shita of the Rambam in the Madura Kama, and what is the shita of the Rambam in the Madura Basra. In Sif Dala, the Rebbe is going to bring up another difference between the two Mahaduras, between the two editions of the Rambams in Pirush Mishnayis, and then the Rebbe is going to connect the two. Wenn wir das verstehen, behaktim noch Aschinu zwischen die zwei Mahaduras von Pirush Mishnayis. Benegeat dem Zman von Einas Nadarim. There's another difference between the two versions of the Rambam and Pirush Mishnayis with regards to Einas Nadarim. What is Einas Nadarim? Das heißt, der Din bei Nadarim, als man darf nicht kein Gadol, ner afilu amufla samach leish is nidrei kayam. The term Einas Nadarim, which literally means the season of Nadarim, or the time period of Nadarim, refers to the din that even a minor, even someone who's not yet bar or bas mitzvah, as long as they know what they're saying, they could still make a neder. In other words, generally in Torah you have to be bar mitzvah or bas mitzvah in order for an obligation to apply. Nedarim, it applies even if you're not fully a gadol or gedela, you're not fully a halachic adult. So this is sometimes called mufla samach leish. Mufla means he knows how to make a neder, but samach leish is not yet an ish, is not yet an adult. And it's also referred to as Einas Nadarim. The question is, when does that Einas Nadarim begin? In Pirush Mishnayis Hanafos Madura Kama, in the more well-known Pirush Mishnayis, which is the first version, as we're calling it in the Sicha, state it says as follows: you check throughout the 12th year for the girl, which means from her 11th birthday to her 12th birthday. From his 12th birthday to the 13th birthday in the case of a boy. As long as we find that they know what they're doing, Nidarav Kayamin, the neder is valid. Even though they are minors, even though they are not adults. The zu hi einas nedarim aramuz elea b'chamakim, and this year before bar or bas mitzvah, that is the einas nedarim that is referred to in wherever it's brought. Das heißt, einas nedarim heipsechan in dem Jahr far gadlus, wenn a keva wenn sie wird abasid alaf yem echad, uzacha ben yudbeis yem echad, und nidreihem nivdokim ebyedim l'shein minadru, und azeish tasrash v'idrishenim. The Rabbi explains that the einas nedarim is the year before bar bas mitzvah, a girl from 11, a boy from 12. And throughout that year, until they become bar or bas mitzvah, they are, whenever they make a neder, they are tested to confirm that they know what they're saying, and then their neder is valid. This is the shita of Rashi and other Rishonim, that Einas Nedarim is the year before bar or bas mitzvah. Mashenkin in Madura Bas Shalei is the Rambam Mishana Unzakt. In Madura Bas, in the second edition, the Rambam changes and he says like this: and after the 12th birthday of the girl, or after the 13th birthday of the boy, which means after they become bar or bas mitzvah, they do not have to be tested, and their nedarim are valid, even though they are not yet adults, which means in halacha, in order to become an adult, you have to both reach the age of adulthood, and also your body has to produce signs of maturity. So even if their birthday changed, in other words, they became 13 for a boy or 12 for a girl, but their bodies have not yet matured, their neder is a neder, even if they don't know what they're talking about. Even if they don't know, we don't test them. But the very fact that they changed, became 12 or 13, even though they're still considered a katan of the halacha, nevertheless their neder is kayam. One of them is their messiah. The zuhi einas nadarim. This, says the Rambam in the Madura Basra, is einas nadarim. After bar mitzvah, before the simonim, before the signs of maturity. Das heißt, Einas Nedarim hebt sich an bin Keva, wenn sie wird abasid beis wie Mechad, und bezacher ben Gimel wie Mechad. That Einas Nedarim refers to a girl from the age of 12, a boy from the age of 13, afilu lo yevir shtei sayros, even if they did not yet produce 2 pubic hairs. And they don't need to be tested. And because their neder is valid, even if they say we have no idea what we said, we didn't know what we were talking about. Nevertheless, once they turn 12 or 13 respectively, they are considered, they go into Einas Nadarim, even though they're not considered a halachic adult, and their neder is valid whether they know it or not. But thus is Shitas HaBahag, this is the Shita of the Bahag, in contrast to the Shita of Rashi and other Rishonim. When Azay paskin the Rambam in Sefer Hayad, the Rambam actually paskins this way in Sefer Hayad as Haben ben Yud Gimel Shana v'Yemechad, v'Habas pas Yud Beis Shana v'Yemechad, af al pi she'amru ein anu yedin l'shemina darnu divreian kayamin v'nedreiam nedarim v'af al pi she'lehiviu shtei seiris v'zuhi einas nedarim ha'amura b'chol makim. Says the Rambam that once the boy turns 13, once the girl turns 12, even if they say we don't know in whose name we were making a neder, and even though they did not yet grow 2 pubic hairs, which is a sign of maturity that makes them an adult al pi halacha, nevertheless, their neder is valid, and this is called einas nadarim. Und der Din von Katan ben Yud Beis Shana im jedem l'shem yinader nidrein kayamin, anal seif aleph, is a bazunder din k'til kaman seif zayin. And the fact that even before bar mitzvah, if they make a neder and they know to whom they are making the neder, their neder is valid, that's a separate din. The din of mufla samach leish, or the din of einas nadarim, according to the second girsa, second version of the Rambam, and which follows the shita of the Bahag, and this is how the Rambam paskins in Sefer Hayad, is after they become bar mitzvah, before they have the simonim of maturity, their neder is kayom, even if they don't understand to whom they're making a neder, and that's einas nadarim. There's a separate din in the Rambam, which we actually learned in the beginning of the Sikha, that even before bar mitzvah, if they make a neder, we can test them, and if they know to whom they're making the neder, then the neder is kayom, but that is not the din of einas nadarim, that's a separate din. Based on this, that we now have 2 versions within the Rambam, when is einas nadarim, as eich der shinui zwischen die 2 Ma'aduris, wenn der Gis in Gemara, v'le yada lahafleis, oder yada lahafleis, is totally in the 2 Shittas and ben einas nadarim. So we now are going to suggest, says the Rabbi is going to suggest, that the 2 versions in the girsa of the Gemara, if you say lo yada lahafleis, then at the beginning of the year they did not know how to make a neder, which was our girsa in Gemara, or the new girsa that yada lahafleis, in the beginning of the year she knew how to make a neder, and yet she still has to be tested for the rest of the year, is dependent. Our question was, what was the Rambam's svara in that Madura Kama? What's the svara in the Madura Basra? So we're going to say that the svaras are going to be dependent on when is einas nadarim. Is einas nadarim before bar mitzvah, or is einas nadarim after bar mitzvah? And based on that, we'll understand why the Rambam takes this girsa in Madura Kama and the other girsa in Madura Basra. In Sifei, the Rebbe is going to give us the Nekudas Abir, and it's going to leave it open-ended, which means we're going to have to go all the way till Sif Ches to fully understand Sif Hey. But he's going to give us the nutshell, and from there we're going to go into understanding it more at length. The Nekudas Abir in them. Leichitas Rambam is Bechlal Nitshayach together from Chazaka. B'shayach zum Das von Katan. So the Rebbe is laying down a foundation here. Earlier on, we said the Rambam is going, according to Madura Basra, the Rambam is going against the idea of chazaka, because the child has a chazaka that they know how to make a neder, and yet we're saying we have to test them again. So the Rebbe says the Rambam holds there's no concept of chazaka when it comes to the knowledge, to the mind of a minor, of a child. For him, there's tights from chazaka is that die Sache stark und verfestigt. What does chazaka mean? That it's strong and that it's fortified, it's firm. And therefore the presumption is that it's going to remain that way because it's strong. By a child, there's no concept of strength, of firmness in their mind, in their intellect. He doesn't, because a child doesn't have true das, true knowledge. One of the features of an adult is that he has the das, so that once he makes a decision, once he makes a resolution, it stays that way. We see clearly that a child is flip-flops. He's not capable of a very strong resolution, and we very easily can change his decision. Ukiyadua di asbara vasakat pachas mit gimel shana. Afilo eber is al kharif u balasago tfiso baki bedinim is the same as lisa se bechitev. Verter nit nenesh. Eber hat ever given up a mitzvah. Weil es felt him das. And as we know, as it's explained, even in Chassidus, it's explained when it explains the concept of meichin the godless by a boy who becomes bar mitzvah. Explains that why is it that a child who is brilliant and understands the halachas of Torah and knows the dinim of this mitzvah saseh, mitzvah leitz saseh, nevertheless, if he transgresses, he does not get punished, because since he lacks the das, he knows he has the knowledge of what to do and what not to do, but he doesn't have the das. He doesn't have what's beneath the knowledge. In the maturity to be able to understand the weight of it, and therefore he doesn't get punished. And therefore says the Rambam that you can't have a chazaka by a katan. A katan might know something today, might change his mind until tomorrow. So just because the katan knew something in the beginning of the year does not form a chazaka. The Refar paskin the Rambam. And therefore the Rambam says that we don't say that once he knows in the beginning of the year, you don't have to check for the rest of the year, you don't have to test for the rest of the year. But that's a svara pshuta. As in them came in chazaka. It's very simple that you can't rely on the knowledge of a child. Even in the beginning of this year, even after they turn 12 or 11 for a girl, because he's still a cotton. He doesn't have the das for it, and therefore says the Rambam, even if the child was tested in the beginning of the year and he knew how to make a neder, nevertheless, at the end of the year, later on in the year, you have to test again. Maybe he forgot. Maybe he changed his mind. Maybe he flip-flopped. So that's clear. That the Rambam holds that even if the child knew in the beginning of the year how to make a neder, we can't rely on that, and we have to test them again throughout the year. And the chilik zwischen die zwei Girsais in Gemara, v'lo yada lahafles, other yada lahafles. So now, how do we understand the Gemara? The din we know. We know that even if the person knew, the child knew how to make an neder in the beginning of the year, still they have to be tested throughout the whole year, because we can't rely on the chazaka. How are we going to understand the Gemara? The two versions of the Gemara is like this. The Girsay in Gemara is Hakatay Techamina, the Badakna Lamed V'leya the Lahafles Ematule Livdek. Our Girsay in the Gemara, the more widespread Girsay, that in the beginning of the year she didn't know how to make a neder, and I would think that you shouldn't have to test. Is later Shita as Enas Nadarim Mainch Nasyud Beis Lektanos Nasyud Gimel Lekatan. V'yodim L'Shemi Nedrin. This follows the Shita that Einas Nadarim is referring to a child before Bar Mitzvah. But late der Shita is for an aggressor chidish in dem din, wie in dem din anal beit knes and kol hashana, af al pivas nimmt zu jedem tchilas hashana. According to this understanding, if you say that even before Bar Bas Mitzvah, that is Einas Nadarim, and that they would be and the neder is a neder, it's a bigger chiddush to say that even though in the beginning of the year they didn't know, you still have to test for the rest of the year. So the Rambam is saying that the Rambam holds that in the beginning of the year, if they knew how to make a neder, it doesn't help. You still have to test for the rest of the year. The Rambam in the Madura Kama is saying, I have a bigger chiddush for you. And that's why the Gemara uses this girsa. Even if they didn't know how to make a neder in the beginning of the year, still you have to test for the rest of the year. What that chiddush is, you have to wait for Sivches. But the reason that the Rambam is guided that way in the Gemara is because that is a bigger chiddush than the chiddush that even if you knew in the beginning of the year, and we understood that the bigger chiddush is, that's what the Radva said, that even though they knew in the beginning of the year, nevertheless, you still have to test for the rest of the year because we're not going to rely on the chazaka. And we thought, there's a chazaka. If you're not relying on the chazaka, that's a big chiddush. And that's what the Radva said. That's why the other Girsa he likes better. The Rebbe is saying over here like this, is that if you say that Einas Nadarim is before Bar Mitzvah, then the bigger chiddush is that if they didn't know how to make an ad in the beginning of the year, you could still test them for the rest of the year. And the Rebbe will explain that in Sivches, so hold your thought. If you follow the second version of the Rambam, that Einas Nadarim is after Bar Mitzvah, is nitakin artlakas al kadaitachas ebadakna v'liyada lahafles. So many different vedics anachamo. There's no. I would never even think that if they didn't know in the beginning of the year, I shouldn't test them again. So I can't use the girsa of v'liyada lahafles because that's obvious. the Riber Muz, the Rambam Annam, and the Girsa built in the Futza. Salka Taita Chamina, the Badak, and the other Lafles, and therefore the Rambam has to change his Girsa. Because the only way to understand the Gemara is in the new Girsa if you say that Einas Adarim is after Bar Mitzvah. I know that I'm leaving, that you're being left hanging, and I'm going to ask for some patience. We'll do Sivav, Siv Zayin, which is not an easy Siv to teach, and in Siv Ches, it's all going to come together. But let's make sure we understand where we're holding. We have two versions in the Gemara according to the Rambam. V'lo yada lahafles, which is our girsa, or v'yada lahafles, which means is the bigger chiddush that when she didn't know how to make a neder, and you can still test for the rest of the year, or is the bigger chiddush that even if she did know how to make a neder, you still test for the rest of the year? We also have two girsais in the Rambam with regards to Einas Adarim. Is Einas Adarim in the year before Bar Mitzvah, or is Einas Adarim in the year after Bar Mitzvah, in the time after Bar Mitzvah, before the body matured? Accordingly, the Rebbe is going to be explaining to us that if you follow the fact that Einas Adarim is before Bar Mitzvah, then the bigger chiddush is that even though she did not know how to make an neder in the beginning of the year, you could still test for the rest of the year. If you say that Einas Adarim is after Bar Mitzvah, then there's no chiddush that if they didn't know, you should check later in the year. The only chiddush that could be said is that even though they did know in the beginning of the year, you still could check for the rest. You still have to check for the rest of the year, and that's why the Rambam takes that girsa Madura Basra. Even though, as we said earlier, he seems to be going up against the concept of the chazaka. So that's not an issue anymore because we said the Rambam doesn't hold chazaka by a cotton in das of a cotton. So the Rambam's chiddush, therefore, as will be explained in Sivches, is based on the words v'yada lahafles and not lo yada lahafles. Okay. The asbara in them. So, in order to understand this, you have to continue weiter, and I promise you, it will all come together. The begether from the Darim Mishnasi Yud Beis Laktana Shnasi Gimel Lakotten, as im Yedin L'Shem Minadar in the Drein Kayamin. The Rebbe is now going to introduce another chakira, another debate, another two sides of a coin to look at. The concept that before Bar Bas Mitzvah, a child, as long as they know to whom they're making the neder, could actually make a neder, is obviously a chiddush. In other words, everything else in Torah is from the age of 13, from Bar Bas Mitzvah. The fact that you're going before Bar Bas Mitzvah, this is a chiddush. What is the chiddush? In other words, what is the parameters of the chiddush? So one way, Aleph, the chiddush is in dem Gil. It's an age thing. As ben Adarim darf man nicht bis dem Gil von Gadlus, ben Gimel Shana v'Yemechad, then Afila ben Yudbei Shana v'Yemechad kemach another. The chiddush is age. That everything else in Torah you need to be 13. For Nedarim you don't need to be 13. Und das, was man darf beutig sein, dem Jedel L'Shem Minadar, the fact that we have to test them to make sure that they know, is as blaze that's only to remove a requirement. Since the din by a neder is they have to know who they're talking to, what they're talking about. You have to know that he's not lacking idea. The fact that we're testing him is not the main point. The main point here is that you don't need to reach the age of 13. It's true, you need to know what you're talking about. So therefore we're going to test him. But the chiddush, according to this approach, is an age thing. You don't need to be 13 or 12 for a girl. Base, so there's another way of looking at this. The ufter is in adas, but a darim is masri a klein adas of tzmachan aneder. Or I could say it differently. You don't need to be a full mind. You don't need the das of an adult to make a neder. Even if you have a weak das, you could still make a neder. Und das, was man darf sein, ben Yudbei Shana v'Yemechad, is blaze asimen. Weil darf in dem Gil is efshiri genug das of the inyan adeder. So you can find them, so feel the das klush eich nita. So in that case, why do you need to be 12? So the answer is because before you're the age of 12, even that minimal amount of das you don't have. So therefore, before that age, you can't make a neder. But once you hit 12 or 11 for a girl, then you may have das klusha, weak das, and the chiddush is that weak das works. So once we test them and we see that they have the das, it works. So in other words, is the chiddush that you don't need to be 13 or 12, or is the chiddush that you don't need to have full das klusha, weaker das suffices? Oh, Siv Zayin, the Rebbe is going to say that this whole debate of Sivav, if the chiddush is age or the chiddush is knowledge, only works before Bar Mitzvah. So it only works if you say Einas Adarim is before bar mitzvah. Whereas if you say that Einas Adarim is after bar mitzvah, like the second version of the Rambam, Pirush Mishnayos, then after bar mitzvah, it's for sure an age thing, because you have to be 13 for a boy, but you don't have to know l'shem minadar. And before bar mitzvah, it's clearly a das thing, nothing to do with age. Again, we'll learn it inside. But if you say that Einas Adarim is before bar mitzvah, then you could debate: is it a chiddush that you don't need to be 13, or is it a chiddush that you don't need knowledge? A full knowledge. If you say that Einas Adarim is after bar mitzvah, and the halacha of course says that after bar bas mitzvah, your neder is a neder even if you don't know to whom you're making a neder, then clearly the fact that after bar mitzvah is a neder is an age thing. You have to be 13 or 12. And before bar mitzvah, the second halacha, that before bar mitzvah you could also make a neder, which we'll see in a second might be according to some things only midrabanan, but the second opinion, the second halacha, that before bar mitzvah it's also a neder, is clearly a yin of das, because the chiddush of Einas Adarim is an age based. So why are we allowing him to make a neder before bar mitzvah? Because he knows. If he knows, we let him make a neder. But it's clearly a das thing. Let's say it inside, and then we'll review it again. This chakira of Sivav, do you say that it's gil or do you say that it's das? This is dependent within the previous discussion of when is Einas Adarim. The tzvei yifanim anal haben an art blaze later shita ashnasid beis lektano ashnasid gimel lekotten is Einas Adarim. Both of these approaches to say is it das or is it, or in other words the chakira, the fact that you can even debate, is it das or gil is age, it only works if you say that Einas Adarim is before bar mitzvah, the 11th year for the girl, the 12th year, it's the 12th year for the girl, the 13th year for the boy. And the chiddush of mufla samach leish is either gil, either age or knowledge. But the fire came in them clear, and therefore we could debate. Thus, the chiddush, the prat from mufla, is the chiddush that mufla as yedei lahafleis, that we trust him to make a neder, or the prat from samach leish, or the yav samach leish managadlos, that because he's already close to bar mitzvah, he could already make a neder. So that would be the question. Gil and das could also be called, gil could be called samach leish, and das could be called mufla. So if mufla samach leish is referring to before bar mitzvah, then you can debate. Are we focusing on the fact that he reached a certain age, or are you focusing on the fact that he reached a certain level of knowledge? Masha'enkin later shita has Einas Adarim is ben yud gimel shana v'yimechad basid vei shana v'yimechad av bish leiviu shtei sidus. But if you're going to say that the 13-year-old or the 12-year-old girl after bar mitzvah who do not have signs of maturity, they are the Einas Adarim, is mistaber as the ganze geder an neder far dem yor von gadlos schnasit beis lektanos as gimel lekotten weil steht nit in shonem no blesen dem was jedem sheminadru. Then the fact that they could make a neder before bar mitzvah is because of the knowledge. If Einas Adarim means you have to be 13 or 12, means that it's clearly after bar mitzvah, it's an age thing. And the fact that you can make a neder beforehand, even though you don't have age, is because of das. So the debate only applies before bar mitzvah. Only if you say that Einas Adarim is before bar bas mitzvah. If you say that Einas Adarim is after bar bas mitzvah, then there's two periods. There's before bar mitzvah, there's after bar mitzvah. After bar mitzvah, it's clearly an age thing. Before bar mitzvah, it's clearly a knowledge thing. Warum? Das ist doch der Zeichen achilles zwischen die zwei Sugimanal in Einas Adarim. Ben yud gimel shana v'yimechad abas yud beis shana v'yimechad al pish leiviu beis sidus beis tas yud beis lektano tas gimel lekotten. Because now you have two categories in Einas Adarim. You have before bar mitzvah, after bar mitzvah. The chiddush atayda ben yud gimel v'yim echad v'abas v'al pish leiviu shtei sidus. The chiddush that after bar mitzvah, even though there's no signs of maturity, nevertheless you could still make it. It's ben shanim as the gil from the Adarim heptechan take if you meveta ben yud gimel shana v'yimechad, that the age begins as soon as you turn 13. Und der din is taken nitva bunde mit das. But the Rambam paskin that half bisham reino dividend kayam, that has nothing to do with das, which is why after 13 or 12 for a girl, even though they didn't. Even if they didn't know to whom they're making another, then they're still another because it's clearly an age-based thing. In this approach, if Einas Adarim is after bar mitzvah, there is a secondary chiddush. For shnastit beis lektano v'shnastit gimel lekotten, was in them is the gather nit from the mitzonim. because he doesn't have Einas Nadarim is 13. He doesn't have the years. He doesn't have the age. So the only reason why he's making the neder is because he's a Dei La'aflis, because he has the das. So in the approach that Einas Nadarim is before bar mitzvah, so which is in a sense a bigger chiddush. Now you have to say, are you saying that you're making that you can make a neder because he doesn't need to be 13, or are you saying he doesn't need to make a neder because he doesn't need the das of a 13-year-old of a god? But if you're saying that Einas Nadarim is after bar mitzvah, then clearly you do need an age. You do need to be 13 to make a neder. So you can't say that before bar mitzvah is an age. There's a chiddush in age. Forget. To make a neder, you have to have the age of 13. There's another chiddush that even though he doesn't have the age, but nevertheless, if he has das, he could make the neder. So according to the second approach of the Madura Basra of the Rambam, that Einas Nadarim refers to after bar mitzvah, then the before Nadarim before bar mitzvah is clearly about das. So to summarize, we'll do the Chavar in a second. To summarize, if you say Einas Nadarim is before bar mitzvah, then there's a room to debate: is it based on age or based on knowledge? If you hold that Einas Nadarim is after bar mitzvah, then the Nadarim that are being made before bar mitzvah are very obviously knowledge based and not age based. Certainly, according to the Ragachover, who explains the Rambam, as Ladas the Rambam is muflo samach lish deiraisa, the rak ben yud gimel shana ben yud gimel bebasid beis levi obeisidus. This is mashna from Pashtus. 1 second, let's pause. The Ragachover holds that according to the Rambam, mufla samach leish is only after bar mitzvah. In other words, before shteisidus, but after bar mitzvah, and that's when midairaisa the neder is a neder. This is mashma from Pashtus Ham Emshech Halosh Rambam, and that's actually out. You can understand clearly from the Rambam. Once they reach the age of maturity, age of either 12 for a girl or 13 for a boy, nidrein kayamin, their neder is valid. Afal pi shelo simanim, even though they did not they don't have signs of maturity. The davar zeh midivrei Torah, and this is midairaisa shehamufla samach leish ekdei even nidrei neder. That someone who's mufla samach leish, which the Rambam clearly is teaching, referring to someone after bar mitzvah, before the simanim of gadlus. The hektish is hektish, and neder is a neder. Masha'enkin der din von shnasid beis lektaner shnasid gimel lekotten, whereas the din of before bar mitzvah, that they can make a neder, is lefitas Rambam lukul yalman nar midrabanan. According to the Ragachover, the Rambam holds that everyone will agree that it's midrabanan. In other words, when mufla samach lish that's midraisa chayiv and chayiv to fulfill his neder is after bar mitzvah. Before bar mitzvah is midrabanan. Doch sicher mistaber as die takanas achavim is verbunden nicht mit dem etzem gil von shnasid beis wie shnasid gimel. Nor der mitzvah says shen yedei l'shem neder. It's obvious that the chacham would not have a misakin if it's a neder is midrabanan. It's obviously that the chacham wouldn't be misakin something based on age, because a neder, any neder has the foundation must be yediyah. So therefore, chacham could not base a neder based on an age. Nor der mitzvah says shen yedei l'shem neder. Und der Vater the chacham gesagt as nidrei neder. If the chacham are being misakin a neder for an earlier age, it's only based on the fact that he has das, because the chacham can't be misakin something based on age, because age is only part of it. You have to have also das. So if the chacham are misakin something for before bar mitzvah, it's obviously das based and not age based. So the Ragachover is just a stronger proof to what the Rebbe is saying earlier, that if you follow the shita that mufla samach leish or Einas Nadarim is after bar mitzvah, then the fact that a pre-bar mitzvah child could make a neder is clearly based on das and not on gil. So again, if you say Einas Nadarim or mufla samach leish is before bar mitzvah, then you could debate: is it a gil thing, is it an age thing, or is it a das thing? But if you say that mufla samach leish is after bar mitzvah, then after bar mitzvah is clearly age based, because you have to be 13 and your das doesn't matter. And before bar mitzvah is clearly das based. Now we'll go to Sifches, and now we're going to form the two different arguments of the Gemara. In other words, the difference in the girsa in the Gemara is all in the Sakat Chamina, as we said in the beginning. What is the Haba Amina? And therefore, based on that, what's the Kamash Malan? What's the Maskana? Now that we understand the fact that there is a possibility for debate in one version, and there is not a possibility for debate in the other version, we will now understand the Havamina of the Gemara and the Maskana of the Gemara according to both Girsois, and why the Rambam in the second Girsa, in the Madura Basra, has to take the Girsa that he does, even though it sort of breaks with the concept of Chazakah. Alpize is move on the Chelek zwischen die zwei Gesais in Gemara. Later Shita, as eines der meint, Schnas Yud Beis Lektana, Schnas Yud Gimel Lekotten, ist verstandig, wie es kann sein, Kosal Gedaitach, als Heichad de Badakna, V'liyada Lahafel Ema Tule Livdik. The Kosal Gedaitach in our Girsa in the Gemara is that if you tested her in the beginning of the year, and she did not know how to make a Shavua, I would think that you're done for the year. Kamas B'Lah, no, you should test again during the year. If you say that Einas Nadarim is before Bar Mitzvah, then that Kosal Kadaitach makes sense. That approach makes sense, and therefore you need the Kamas Malan. Weil es kann sein, als der Iker Geder von Ufala Samach Lishis mit Tzad Shanim, das heißt, Teirat Megala Geden, als der Gil von Basil Aleph, V'yem Echad, can aufmachen ein Eder. Since there is a debate, is this an age thing or a das thing? So I would think that it's an age thing. That Torah tells us that when a girl turns 11, for example, 11 in a day, she can make a neder. So what's my thought? Vibald mirzen as diktano zayin dik begil ze leyod lafleis. And once we see in the beginning of the year that she reached the age of 11 and she does not know how to make a shvua, is araya as ba'irot there's manituv ketan gadlus. That proves that the fact that she turned this age did not give her the maturity that she needs. And therefore, we should postpone her the darim making until she actually turns 12. In other words, since there is room for debate, is it age-based? Is it das-based? So I would say like this. I could have thought, I would think, that the reason why a mufla samach lish could make a neder is age-based. But it means to say that we're saying that a girl at the age of 11 or a boy at the age of 12 potentially has the ability to make a neder. So now when they turn 11 years old and we test them and they don't know how to make a neder, I would think that since she already proved that her age didn't do what it was supposed to do, so she's out until she turns 12. Of them is kamash malan di mishnas that ikh khidish atere is as the das for shnas yud beis luktan with gimel cotton ken uften another comes the mishnah and says kamash malon that it's not about age, it's about das. That once they have a certain amount of das, they can make a neder. Und der Riber wenn nor sie bekommt dem das, and therefore whenever she receives that das, b'meshach shnas yud beis, even in the middle of the year, is nidra neder. Und der Feier darf ständig beidig sein, and therefore we have to check for the rest of the year. Maybe she gained the knowledge in the middle of the year. If it's an age thing, the Kasal Kadaitach is that it's an age thing. And once she didn't pass the test in the beginning of the year, this age is out. So I would think you don't have to test anymore. Until she turns 12, she's out, she can't make a neder. Kamash Malon, that it's not an age thing, it's a das thing. And therefore, whenever she gains the das, she can make a neder. So even though in the beginning of the year she didn't have the das, nevertheless, maybe half a year later, she'll have the das. So we'll test again. So now, because there is a debate, is it gil or is it das? So that is the havamina and the maskana. Kasal kadaitach that it's an age thing, and therefore once she hits 11, if she can't make another, she can't make another for the rest of the year. Kamas malan, it's a das thing. Whenever she gains the das, she can make another. Move on. As dikos al gedaitach atasach mer ort dikos al gedaitach ayol benim so jedem mit schil shana einstichen bedika, and this is a much more powerful chiddush. Kanal as isvar psute is mechayev as is dod the geder for chazaka b'shaychas und das von cotton. So if in the beginning of the year she did know how to make a neder, the fact that you have to make a neder again later is not a chiddush, because the Rambam holds that there's no chazaka. Or it's a smaller chiddush, I should say, because Rambam holds no chazaka. So the fact that even though she did not know in the beginning of the year how to make a neder, still you're baidik, because it's about das, and the das could come at any time, that's a bigger chiddush than the fact that you would be baidik, even though she knew in the beginning of the year. Because that's obvious, because she's a cotton, and a ktana doesn't have chazaka. So therefore, in the Madura Kama of the Rambam goes with the girsa of le yoda lehaflois, because that says the Rambam is a much bigger chiddush. If you remember in Sifei, The Rabbi said, what's the Gresser Chiddush? That even though she did not know how to make a neder, and you might have thought that she disqualified herself for the rest of the year, Kamaspela know that she could, if she gains das in the middle of the year, she could make a neder. And that's what the Rambam chooses. That was the svara of the Rambam in the Madura Kama, that this is a bigger Chiddush. And that's why he was guided like this. But this only works if you say that Einas Nedarim is before Bar Mitzvah. Because only in that case do you have this Chakira. Is it age or is it das? Aber leit maskanas Rambam as the geder verschnasiyot beis lektano shnas gimel lekotten is blaze mit geder adas kanal sivav. But if you hold like the Madura, if you hold like the Madura Basra of the Rambam, that Einas Nedarim is after Bar and Bas Mitzvah, and therefore before Bar Mitzvah or Bas Mitzvah, the only reasons that they can make a neder is because of das. Is Adrabe. Es hat kein Ort nicht zu sagen, als weil man nicht gehabt das mit Chilas Hashanah, darf man nicht wieder beidig sein, efshe es danach zukommen das, wie es da sein Alpi Teva. Then if in the beginning of the year they didn't know how to make a neder, then there's no reason to say not to test. There's no hava mina not to test. Because naturally, as a child grows older, they gain das. So if there was a svara that it was gil, so you would say, okay, then maybe not to test again for the rest of the year. But according to the maskana of the Rambam, that Einas Nedarim is after Bar Mitzvah, and before Bar Mitzvah is all based on das, then obviously if they didn't know how to test in the beginning of the year, how to make a neder in the beginning of the year, then you'll test again later. Maybe they gain more das. If it's all about das can come anytime, and that's the nature that as they grow older, they gain more das. So you can't have the havamina of lo yad al haflis. You can't use that girsa because there's no such svara that you shouldn't check if they didn't know in the beginning of the year. Muz the Rambam onem the girsa sagadat hachamin of yad al haflis. So the Rambam has no choice but to take the other girsa. That I would think that if they knew at the beginning of the year that you shouldn't check for the rest of the year. And this is the chiddush. That even though in the beginning of the year the cotton had sufficient das to make a neder, it's not sufficient das to classify it as a chazaka, and therefore they have to be tested again. Even though we said that the Rambam doesn't hold, the Rambam holds that there's no such thing as chazaka, but that would be the chiddush of this Gemara, that there's no chazaka. That even though Yad al Haflis, even though in the beginning of the year they knew, nevertheless, so they already had das in the beginning of the year, nevertheless, we can't rely on that das because there's no chazaka, and therefore you have to check again. You have to test again every time they make a neder. So in other words, now that we understand what we explained in Sivav and Zayin, that before Bar Mitzvah, if Einas Nedarim is before Bar Mitzvah, there's a Makim Loimar that it's Gil, that's age, not Das, then I have a very interesting Salkadat Chamina. I could say that Lo Yoda Lahaflis, she didn't know how to make it in the beginning of the year, but nevertheless, I would think that she's disqualified for the year because this age doesn't work for her. Kamash it's not the age, it's Das, and therefore you have to test throughout the year. Maybe she gained Das, but if you go according to the second Madura of the Rambam, that Einas Nedarim is after Bar Mitzvah, then before Bar Mitzvah is clearly only about Das, then there's no Hava Amina that if they knew in the beginning of the year, that if they didn't know in the beginning of the year, that you wouldn't test. Because it's all about Das. Every time we have to check, maybe she got Das. So in the question of the beginning of the Sikha, what forces the Rambam to change the Girsa to V'yod al-Havles, this is it. Because he holds that before Bar Mitzvah is all about Das, the only Chiddush would be that Yod al-Havles, that she knew how to make a neder, and nevertheless, the Chiddush is that we're not relying on the Chazaka because it's a Katan or a Ktana, and therefore you test the whole year every time they make a neder to make sure that they still have the Das. It took a lot of patience, but once you get to this point, it everything fits into the box. Everything fits in. There's a Madura Kama, there's a Shite of Einas Nedarim, which explains to us the Chakira, the Havamina, which explains to us the Maskana. Then there's another Shite in Einas Nedarim, which explains to us what the Havamina is, what the Maskana is. The Hakoil al Mekoimei Ba B'Shalom. Unbelievable. Tess. Yes, the Varatama Rambam. Now the Achra of the Rambam, certainly according to the Rogachover, is and that's the Madura Basra in the Pirush Mishnayos, that Einas Nedarim is after Bar Mitzvah. It's referring to a case of a boy after 13 or a girl after 12, but do not have the signs of maturity. So why does the Rambam hold that this is Einas Nedarim over the before Bar Mitzvah? So the Rebbe explains as follows. In the meaning of Nedarim is the Achidush Nifla, the whole concept of a neder has an incredible chiddush. As a yid to matfis ein adavar amuter. As is unless there's a carbon, that a yid has control over something that according to Torah is permissible, and it should become prohibited to him like a carbon. Carbon. So much so that it contains a holiness, like a carbon. That this thing is usher unto me, I'm not allowed to touch it like it's holy. And the truth is that in neder, the chiddush is even greater than by a carbon. A carbon has rules. Only certain types of animals, certain types of things that grow, certain types of inanimate objects are worthy, are allowed to be brought onto the mizbeach. But by a neder, there's no agbalas, there's no rules. Once you take control over this thing, could even be tummy. Now you could take something that's tummy, which you couldn't bring out to the mizbeach. But now when a person makes a neder on that, it gains a certain kedusha. So now you have this incredible paradox. As the on the one hand needs incredible strength, more than other mitzvahs, because you're taking something that the Torah did not prohibit and you're elevating it. Zog Teda, as a fila cotton was alle andere mitzvahs are nicht shaykh, kenuf tanak dik dusha eber as muflas samach leish. Teda says that even though you need to have more strength than most mitzvahs, nevertheless the child who is muflas samach leish could make this neder. Learn the Rebbe the Rambam. The Rambam learns, according to the Rabbi Chaver, as dayoy zu sagen dem chidus ben agiyah kagarten was igiel nicht negadlus. Then es felt in bleis simanim. It's enough to say this incredible chiddush on the child that is over bar mitzvah, just lacks the signs of maturity. Aber nicht sagen nach aggressiven chiddush at the yedei lahaflis von aben yud beishan of yimechad so can nuften as akdusha b'li agbalas. But to say that someone who's not even bar mitzvah yet could accomplish such a kedusha, that's too big of a chiddush. The Rambam doesn't want to go there. So that's the explanation. Very simple. Why does the Rambam prefer to say that Oynas Nadarim is after bar mitzvah? Because since the whole concept of neder is such an incredible concept that you're taking something, you're going beyond anything else that Torah does, and you're able to create your own holiness with your own words, with your own power, which you should need to be very strong. And nevertheless, the Torah says that neder can work even with a child. It must be a child that's over bar mitzvah. To say that it applies to a child under bar mitzvah is too big of a chiddush. The Rambam doesn't want to take it. This would be the approach of the Rabbi Chaver, who teaches in the Rambam that he holds Einos Nadarim is after bar mitzvah. Yud Afal became is the day of Kama Rishonim Lekam Achrim Echter Das Rambam as a mufla samach leish was nidrei nadim natayda meint al kaponim eicha ben Yud Gim Beit Shanav Yimechad Videi Lahavlis. There are many Rishonim and certain Achronim even teach in the Rambam that mufla samach leish and his neder is a neder midoiraisa applies even before bar mitzvah in the year before bar bas mitzvah. So if we just said that's such a big chiddush, the Rambam, according to this other approach, the Rambam doesn't want to go so far to say that even before bar mitzvah you could take a davar that's something that's mutar al pitera and give it a kedusha. Then what would be the svara of the opinion that it could be done even before bar mitzvah? Es verstehen leit wieder Tzemach Tzedek is mevar the tam of them was by darim seine netad agbalas v'chazane bakabanis. So we're going to bring in a little bit of chassidus here. And the Tzemach Tzedek explains why Taka by Nadarim do not have the same limitations as you have by Karbonis. Says the Tzemach Tzedek like this: as the Indian from Karbonis is was Nasa Kedesh al Pigzedes Atera Shia Chachma Elyon. The idea of a carbon means it became holy because Torah, which is the Chebish's Chachma, decreed that this should be holy. So Torah said that if a person have a carbon Eilah, it has a kedusha. Shaking durch Nadarim. When it comes to the Darim, we're drawing down a kedusha that's higher than Chachma. A carbon is coming from the Chachma of Torah. The Darim is coming from a level that's higher than Chachma. But thus the Rem is in Lashon Hakasav Ishki Yafli Linder. As the Darim come from the Madrege was what angerufen Yafli Lashon Pella. But it says Hecher from Chachma v'Seichel. The word Yafli literally means, like we said before, to express words. But Yafli also has the same shoydish as the word Pella, which means a wonder, something that's beyond. So because the neder reaches a holiness that's higher than Chachma, that's why I use the lesson Yafli, because it's coming from a place that's higher than the Chachma of Teda, higher than Seichel. How does a Yid have the power to reach beyond Torah is done by Yidden mitzadem vas Yisrael kadmul Torah, is because Yidden have this level where they are higher than Torah. The bond between Yidden and Hashem is higher and deeper than Torah. Was the fire Yisrael Yisraelu afilu Ha'id was hit nit Torah responding Islam. Where the nit is Yisrael Chasham, which is why Yid, even though he doesn't keep Torah, doesn't lose his status as a Yid because a Yid is higher than Torah. And this is seen in the idea of a neder, was the deeper Adam to that the person's words could create a kedusha according to his own will. He's not limited to Torah. Karbanis are limited to Torah. Torah says he has to be a seh, a tamim, a zacha, whatever it is, has to be this, and therefore, so a carbon, you're limited to the rules of Torah. By a neder, a person is, because the Yid is kadmul Torah, the Yid rises above Torah, and therefore has the ability to make something that even al pi Torah is not a kaddish, he can make it kaddish. We're going to go into our brackets, but the Rabbi is going to conclude after the brackets, and therefore, even before Bar Mitzvah, before he was a Giyah LaMitzvahs, before he reaches the Darga of learning Torah, doing mitzvahs, he could already make a neder, because he's higher than Torah. So before Bar Mitzvah, he's on this level where he's not yet a Giyah LaMitzvahs. The Rabbi will say it inside, but we're going to veer off in the brackets for a moment or two. So the Rabbi says, just to clarify, if Nedarim are higher than Torah, then we have to remember that the din of Nedarim is in Torah. Nor afal became so an eich Nedarim on mitzvah in Torah, but alle yanim from Avodas Hashem and it's gala durch Torah. Anything that's connected with Avodas Hashem is revealed into this world through Torah. It's like tshuva, which supersedes Torah. Someone sinned against the Torah, and yet tshuva could bring him back. So tshuva obviously transcends Torah. When they asked Torah what to do, he said, bring an asham, because that's what Torah says to do. When a person sins, you bring an asham. Hashem is the one who says yasa tshuva, that you could do tshuva. That tshuva is being an example of tshuva. That on the one hand, tshuva is higher than Torah, which is why the whole concept of tshuva comes from Hashem and not from Torah. Which is why tshuva has the power to fill the void that was created because of the lack of fulfilling of doing Torah. The alpha begin is nevertheless, Torah is the one that tells us about the possibility and the power of tshuva. Because tshuva is one of the 613 mitzvahs. So on the one hand, tshuva transcends Torah, but Torah is the one that tells us about it. So to Nedarim, its energy, its source, originates higher than Torah, but yet its revelation to us is through Torah. So that was a side point. Continuing the original point, that Nedarim reaches higher than Torah. This explains why, when it comes to Nedarim, the power comes even before he's obligated in the rest of the mitzvahs. Because Nedarim is connected to his existence as he is higher than Torah. And this is the whole concept of mufla samach leish. He knows how to reach to that high level. The ultimate das, that becomes complete once he becomes 13 or 12. No, das was by him is the lahafles. As in dem zman kumt ihm in rein the das was by him is the lahafles. As in dem zman kumt ihm rein die madrege von palace when the shamas around the chachmei von gali. What happens when mufla samach leish? The chiddush is that the lahafles, the ability to reach the level of pella, the level that transcends chachma, that he could reach it in a revealed way, that's the chiddush of mufla samach leish. And that's why it's before bar mitzvah. Because that's when he's able to reach lahafles. Once he becomes bar mitzvah, he's very das. So now he has a relationship with Torah like any other mitzvah. By Nedarim, he has a relationship with Pelashim and Neshama. And that's why Dafka there is the chiddush that you can make a neder. Because the chiddush is that even though he's not yet at full level of das, he could still reach Kadmul Torah, he could still reach higher than Chachma, he could reach the Pelashim and Neshama.